Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm delighted to be here today with Vanessa Liu, who is a McKinsey alum and the co-founder and CEO of Sugarwork, which is a tool that helps enterprises own their tacit knowledge. So, Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Will.
So uh, we're doing here an audio only episode, but I am, on a video call with you, and I'm looking at the dashboard of Sugarwork, and so I will sort of give a audio narration of what you see as we do a walkthrough of it. But before we dive into the details, tell me just a little bit more of an intro into Sugarwork and expand a bit on my very brief description of the tool that you've built.
Of course. And I think that many of us who have been in consulting, we know just the power of tacit knowledge. Like at the end of every McKinsey study, um, at least like my teams were always asked to digest those tacit insights so that the next teams, the next clients could benefit from it. So I started thinking many, many years after I left, what if this could be at the fingertips of companies out there, especially during a time when there is like a lot of change. There are many people leaving companies because they're retiring. And also now the AI agentic world is upon us. And so every company is trying to think about how do you automate? But if you're going to be building agents, you actually need to know what the humans do. So that is the type of information that we're trying to capture for companies.
All right. So capture the tacit knowledge. Potentially the AIs can do it for us in the future. It would be like as one potential outcome. Let
Or
me just
augment.
augment. Well, I mean, okay, it's augment, enhance. So let me just explain what I'm seeing here on this dashboard. There's on the left-hand side, there's a strip with the admin section, a manage section, a participate section, and then I'm seeing a dashboard with there's a sort of a Kanban board of different areas. It's one is like not started, in progress, completed, or overdue. So it looks like we can have cards that we move across for particular areas, right? And
Right.
why don't you walk me through here what I'm seeing?
Yeah. So essentially, what we've created is a way for companies to capture this kind of information from people at scale. They can assign employees to share information with one another. So every tile that you're mentioning on the Kanban board represents a different set of people within a company that's been asked to share knowledge with one another. So there's at least one person sharing knowledge, at least one person receiving knowledge. It doesn't have to be one and one. And what the goal of what we're trying to do to enable companies to capture tacit knowledge is to give them structured guides to ask the right questions, because so much of the time, if you ask an expert, hey, why do you do things a certain way, the immediate answer might be, well, I just know that this is the right way, and it's very hard to tease out why is that the case. So what we have in here, in addition, for a way for a company to track these knowledge shares being done, is that we actually give them essentially a structured discussion guide. So the participants, the expert, can be asked by the person who needs that information a certain set of questions that will tease out the insights that they need. And so we arm the employees and the companies with this type of toolkit.
Okay, great. Maybe you could walk me through one of the examples, one of those Kanban cards, and like what are the kind of questions that we would be asking? Like what type of tacit knowledge are we getting after?
Yeah, so maybe we could drop onto one around engineering. And so we have two participants where one is basically trying to onboard somebody to the company in engineering to discuss what are the engineering team's practices to onboard this new team member. So they basically, if we see their page, we could see the topics that they want to go through. So the types of questions that we start off with are, very, very basic questions, things like, hey, could you talk about your role and responsibilities? Could you talk about how does your role tie to the organization's success? And I think it becomes more interesting when you dive into areas like the challenges that someone sees. Like, what are the most common challenges that you face? If you ask an engineer that, they might not necessarily have it written down, but they could talk about it. Or you can ask something like, what types of problems do people come to you to solve? And I think we've all been in organizations before where if you know that you have a particular issue, they're just like, oh, please go to Jane. Jane is the person who knows all of this. And that's actually not necessarily something that is written down anywhere, but it becomes part of the essentially the operational wisdom that people have. So those are the types of questions that we try to draw out. And even things like describe a problem you had to solve recently that went well. Walk me through what happened. And even in the idea of walking it through, you understand a lot about that company's culture, how they approach things. Why does this person have that particular expertise?
Okay, maybe you could click onto that core technical questions tab. I'm curious to see what other sorts of, okay. So this is for engineering. I'll just read off some of these questions that I'm seeing. Like, what are the key technologies, frameworks, and programming languages used in the projects you've worked in? Can you walk me through the overall architecture and design? Are there any parts of the code base that are particularly complex or fragile? And then goes on to other technical questions. And what is the idea? Is it that two people would have a conversation, or is it that the person would just get interviewed by the actual Sugarwork tool itself and the AI would interview the person? How is it structured? And then I guess it gets just recorded as a Zoom or as just the audio. Walk me through what happens with this.
Yes, so this is all about so we're giving the tools to the company so they can interview each other. What we found, we work primarily with manufacturing companies, companies that are like mid-cap sizes where there is like basically a healthy dose of nervousness around AI. So even though we could have an AI avatar ask these questions, all the companies are like, look, we don't want to spook our people. We actually want them to be interviewed by other people in the organization. And when we go into a company, they're doing this type of work for a couple of reasons, usually. They're usually PE backed and they're thinking, hey, we want to just know what is like if we're about to acquire a company, if it's a PE firm about to acquire a company, they want to know what do these people do? Where does the know-how lie? And so they know that if it's going to be an AI avatar, they're not necessarily going to get the answers. If there's somebody in the company asking, then they'll get it. So they come into the platform, they schedule a meeting, and it's a video meeting. It could be on Google Meet, on Teams, on Zoom. We're integrated into all of those just through single sign-on. And essentially, the participants then go and have a session where we send in an AI note taker into the meeting. They go through the discussion questions and talk about it. And at the end, our AI renders a summary of the meeting, just like an Otter or Fireflies or Zoom Copilot or Microsoft Copilot. And you can actually see the AI transcribing the conversation and you can see the raw data of the meeting. So you can see the raw video meeting. And so you could see the participants, what they share. They also can upload shared resources. So this all goes into a repository. So typically our clients are using this to, for instance, have 100 people interviewed across the board at a very short compressed period of time because they want to do a transformation or they
Mhm.
want to um, do like some type of like launch of something new. So usually that's the scale that we are at. And then this is all accessible on a permissions-based basis for the rest of the company to consume. But this is basically the company can set it because you can imagine that if people in HR are talking about the upcoming comp changes to the business, you don't necessarily want the rest of the business to be able to search and query that, but you want the HR team to be able to do that. So we have a way for people to essentially see those knowledge shares that they have access to and ask questions as if they were talking to those people. And this is especially useful if those people have moved on or they're really busy. So you can ask things like, in these knowledge shares, I wasn't a part of it, but I want to know why we work with a particular vendor. So you can actually do a query that is underpinned by, in this case, ChatGPT.
Uh-huh. Um, what is your recommendation? What do you see companies doing in terms of who the interviewer is? Like I imagine
Mm,
one model is you have a a smart uh, person who is like a trained interviewer. It could be an analyst level person or someone right out of school or something who you hire as a contractor or employee, whatever. Okay, you are going to just interview everyone in the company. You do all 200 interviews, and that's that
yeah.
person's job. And they probably get pretty good at asking interviews and they seeing certain repeating themes or whatever. Another one would be more to what you were showing me, like this onboarding of a junior person in that group
Yeah.
interviews someone in that group. So, like, and then you have multiple different interviewers. What's the typical approach that you recommend?
Yeah, I would say that there are two different use cases primarily, and it calls for two different approaches. One approach is a company is trying to essentially document how things are done in a process. And so when it comes to that, they will have a project manager who is familiar with the work, sitting down with the various people involved. So it could be a new product development process where 7 departments are involved. A project manager would then sit down with each, like a representative from each of the 7 departments, asking the same questions so you can draw out the process and we can render a process map. So there, that is very much like, hey, we want to map that. We want to then figure out we want to where we want to optimize the process. So that's one use case. A second use case is really understanding what people do for like succession planning work, or because you're about to do a transformation where you're not trying to piece that together with other knowledge shares per se to come up with something. And there you can just have people basically throughout the organization do those types of knowledge shares. And so I think a very good example of that is if a company for skills building basically matches people who are very tenured with people who are earlier tenured, and they say like, look, why don't you talk about how you do X, Y, and Z? um, you can have that across the board so people are being trained at the same time, but that information then gets captured for other people to access it. And so it's like a different type of use case.
I see. Um, One sort of use case that I could imagine for this is what McKinsey used to call, maybe they still do, kind of the activity value added analysis, the AVA project, which is basically a cost cutting project where you'd go in, you'd
Right.
ask everybody to, like, okay, tell me all the different things that you do. How many times per week do you do that? How many minutes does it take? And then
Yes.
how often do you do it? And then you'd look at all those and say, okay, these activities are taking 37% of this person's time of this whole group. We can eliminate that activity. It's not worth it. And then we can take 7 people, make it a two-person group, whatever. Right. I can imagine this
Yeah.
tool can be used for that purpose. Uh, Talk about that a little bit. Is that one of the potential use cases? Are you kind of discouraging or encouraging that as a use case?
I think that that falls into the business optimization use case, like the first one around mapping a process, because the companies that we work with are mapping processes not just for the sake of documenting it, but also to see where they can optimize it and to understand where people are spending time. So an example would be something that like an output could be, this is how this, if we take that new product development process example, these are the 14 steps that are involved. This is how it looks like across the 7 departments. And when it comes to handoffs, we basically layer on where the pain points are to say like, hey, this step between the commercialization kickoff and initial planning and scoping, something goes wrong there where it's sometimes taking like 3 weeks for that to be done. And we want to understand why. So we are doing those analyses for our clients, and then they go in and say, hey, we need to find a solution for that. We might need to change the configuration of the people involved. We might need to think about how these handoffs are, but they are essentially using this type of tool to quickly um, help them understand where bottlenecks are.
Oh, okay. Now, my understanding is that your tool is not really intended to be used for the super fine process mapping of like step by step how to do a specific task. Like it, oh, here is how we send an invoice at this company. And it's not intended to capture the step by step of, well, oh, you click here and then you upload a file and it has to be formatted this way. And then you hit, change select the client here and hit send. It's not kind of at that level of detail. Is that right? It's a bit higher, higher level of altitude.
Well, we can get that level of detail. It's all about the questions that we ask the people, of course. And
Hmm.
so if we want to get at that level, actually we're about to do a piece of work where we're trying to understand a sales process where the sales are coming in essentially via email, but they're five different customer segments. And they're trying to understand, is there a difference in terms of the customer segments, in terms of how they come in? So we're going to be asking that nitty-gritty information, but what we won't like, there are other companies that are better at doing things like screenshots. Like, hey, you're gonna go from HubSpot to your Shopify account and to cut and paste here. We're not good at that.
Okay. All right. Um, and then once let's say you've done the 100 interviews, so all these recordings and individual call summaries are available. What else does SugarWorks do in terms of like, let's say 50 people out of those 200 talked about their role in the budgeting process. Does it show you
Right.
some sort of, here is a consolidated map of everyone who touches the budget process across the whole company and their individual role in it? So you can have like a consolidated view of everybody cutting across those interviews.
Yeah, so that's like what we get from querying the information. And then so we've identified some of this type of work to derive like what are some of the key themes? Like what we've done before for clients are things like, hey, how many times did this issue around like personnel like needing more resources come up? And we can say, oh, it was mentioned 31 times across 22 interviews. Like we're
Hmm.
able to get that type of detail across all of it. Or we can also say, hey, we have 500 interviews that happened. What were just some of the things that came up again and again and again? And we can run that type of analysis across. And so these are some of the things that we've identified where you can go through the data, query it, and get out this type of output.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Um, Talk to me a little bit about your customers that you're targeting right now. What sort of entities are using your software platform?
Yeah, there are, I would say that they fall into a couple of camps. One is a company mid-size, typically they are going through some type of digital transformation and they just want to be able to make change really quickly and where they want to run these analyses before they make changes. And some of these are companies that are large enough where they would hire a consulting firm in there, but they're thinking, hey, we want to reserve like a very big budget for bringing in like a McKinsey or a Bain or a BCG. We want to run some preliminary things ourselves. That's like where we come in and they can use our platform to do that, to understand like, hey, what do these 200 people do for this particular like customer segment before we decide like what could be the optionality that could be something that we would run. um, Usually what we find too is that there is like a lot of wanting to understand either best practices or the talent side or the processes. So those are the three main questions that we get. What are the best practices that we can port over, or what is it that our people do and we can enable them to do better? Because if we want to pursue a new strategy, do we have the right team? And the third thing around processes is always around automation. So that's the first set of customers. And what we're also finding is a second set of small consultancies that are coming to us to say, hey, we want to use your tool to run this type of analysis with the work that we're doing with our clients because we're small, we don't have many people. We could hire more people to join our teams, but like if your tool can help us crunch data and do this type of work faster, that would be another thing that we can do. So we just had a small consulting firm, for instance, use us to do work with a government agency where they had to do many, many interviews. And so this was what they came to us for. They're like, we have 5 people on our team. We didn't want to expand it to 10. We think that we could scale because we can use you because the synthesis is going to be faster.
Okay. And can you share anything about your pricing and your pricing structure?
Yeah, so for companies, like individual companies, if I think about the PE driven type of company, we typically say like, oh, bring us in for a diagnostic. The diagnostics start anywhere between 25 and 40K for like a 2 to 3 month piece of work. And then afterwards, they could decide to roll that out to other departments. And so, like, per department, they would pay an additional fee, like usually 20K per department. And if they want the data ongoing, then they would subscribe to the platform so they can then keep on asking and querying that data. That's usually like $5,000 a month on top after we finish basically these deep dives into the departments. For the consulting firms that we've been working with, like so far, we've only like really like played around with the per seat model, like how many interviews do you need to do? And we price it accordingly so that there's like if you need to like interview 100, like 500 to do 500 interviews over the course of a year and keep track of all of that and do all of the digesting, they basically bake us into their pricing for their clients. And so it runs typically anywhere between $1,000 a seat is the cap, but we can start off at like 200. So it's like
Oh,
200 to 1,000 for a year. And so that's how we look at in terms of the number of people they need to interview.
oh, okay. Number of people that they interview is based on that.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And like the $200 for this, like how many interviews would that be? Like,
It could be just like one, it would be one person, like that's one person you interview for the year. So it's like, so typically they buy us in packages of 25. And so they're like, there are 25 people I need to interview. It
yeah,
only makes sense to use us when you have
right.
a large number of interviews to process. But it's not 25 individual interviews. You could interview each person 5 times, 10 times, but you're still just getting the benefit of that.
Oh, okay. Cool. Amazing. So where can people find you online if they wanted to learn more about the company?
Yep, they could find us at sugarwork.com or also find me at LinkedIn. And so I think my LinkedIn profile is Vanessa W. Liu, Liu. And yeah, always happy to hear from folks, especially consultants, because that's near and dear in my heart.
Amazing. All right, Vanessa, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Will.